Picture the dim glow of a stage light cutting across a smoky honky-tonk somewhere in Middle America, maybe in the 1950s. The band is warming up, steel guitar moaning softly like an echo off some distant canyon wall. A petite young woman with a fierce glimmer in her eyes steps forward and takes the microphone. She's not here to play second fiddle to anyone, not tonight, not ever. She's here to sing straight from the heart, with a voice so pure it seems to pierce right through the haze. In that moment, you're witnessing Jean Shepard, a woman who carved a space in country music history by mixing raw honky-tonk spirit with the spark of a rebellious pioneer. By the end of her decades-long journey, she would become a symbol of traditional country, a champion for the music that shaped her, and the longest-running living member of the Grand Ole Opry. An astonishing 60 years. Let's travel through the twists and turns of her life, from her earliest struggles to the final bow that came far too soon, but left a legacy no one can deny. Jean Shepard was born Ollie Imogene Shepard on November 21st, 1933, though she would later be known to the world simply as Jean. From the start, she was drawn to music the way a moth is drawn to a flame. Born into an era still reeling from the Great Depression, she grew up without the comforts many take for granted. Yet that struggle had a way of sharpening both wit and ambition. Like many aspiring artists, she found her first stages in local clubs and informal gatherings, anywhere she could let that powerful voice ring out. She was still just a teenager when her talents got serious attention. In the early 1950s, she'd formed an all-girl band, something practically unheard of in country music at the time, called the Melody Ranch Girls. That group ended up performing around California, and it helped Jean gain the confidence to believe she could do more than just sing for spare change at roadside taverns. Word began circulating that this girl, named Jean Shepard, had serious stand-on-your-own 2 feet grit and a stage presence that commanded attention. Eventually, Capitol Records came knocking. Suddenly, there she was in Hollywood on September 30th, 1952, standing in front of professional equipment, cutting her very first Capitol Records sides. Her debut single was Crying Steel Guitar Waltz, a collaboration with the legendary steel guitarist Speedy West. It didn't light up the charts, but it planted a flag. She was in the ring now, ready for whatever came next. And whatever came next arrived in May 1953 in the form of an unexpected collaboration with Ferlin Husky, a partnership that would change her life. Ferlin showed up with a song called A Dear John Letter. The tune was simple enough. A woman writes to her soldier husband, telling him she's leaving him for someone else. Jean sang the female part, Husky did a spoken recitation as the soldier, and together they found pure magic. Capitol released it that July. No one, perhaps not even John herself, could have predicted the lightning in a bottle phenomenon about to occur. A Dear John Letter blasted to the top of the country charts and soared to number 1, 4 on the pop charts, a rare crossover achievement. Suddenly, she was in the thick of a success that had radio stations and fans clamoring for more. They followed up with Forgive Me, John, which also charted impressively. Any illusions that A Dear John Letter was a fluke were banished for good. But there was a twist. Jean, not yet 21, wasn't legally allowed to cross state lines without a guardian. So Ferlin Husky became that guardian on paper. It might sound quaint today, but at the time, if a promoter in another state wanted her to perform, they needed her legal guardian's consent. That arrangement only added to her mystique. This teenage star, unstoppable on the charts, still needing an adult chaperone to sign off on her professional travels. Jean soon found herself traveling nonstop, part of lavish tours that took her everywhere, from dusty dance halls to more prestigious venues, that had once been the domain of exclusively male lineups. By 1954, she had recorded 4 more singles for Capitol, including 2 whoops and a holler. The lively rockabilly sounds nibbling at country's edges might have influenced her style, but she was a honky-tonk girl through and through. She parted ways with Ferlin Husky's duet act that same year, briefly relocating to Beaumont, Texas, managed by Neva Starnes, and opened shows for a rising star named George Jones. He was on the cusp of big things, and so was Jean. In 1955, she joined the Ozark Jubilee, a nationally broadcast television program that proved a significant stepping stone for many country hopefuls. On one episode, Jean performed a tune called A Satisfied Mind. The performance brought such a strong public reaction that Capitol Rush released it as a single. Competing versions by other artists like Porter Wagoner were also out there, but Jean soared up to number 1, 4 on the country chart. Around the same time, she scored another hit with I Thought of You, placing her in a very select group of women in country music, Kitty Wells being the prime example, actually cracking the top 10 charts as solo artists. Jean's star was burning bright. Then came November 21st, 1955, her 22nd birthday. That night she was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry. Let that sink in. In an era where women in country were often relegated to background roles or novelty status, Jean Shepard walked onto the hallowed Opry stage as only the 4th woman in the cast, standing alongside Minnie Pearl, Kitty Wells, and Del Wood. She took the invitation as a signal that she was not just welcome, but that she belonged. Before long, she was headlining her own shows, proving to radio DJs, promoters, and male peers that a woman could pack a venue, command a band, and hold her audience in the palm of her hand. Early in 1956, she released her debut album, Songs of a Love Affair. Not only did it serve as a testament to her vocal talent, it also became one of country music's earliest concept albums, tracing a woman's emotional journey through infidelity and heartbreak. That was bold, especially at a time when female singers were expected to simply echo the tropes set by men. Jean's willingness to tackle intimate, sometimes even scandalous topics gave her an edge. Fans heard her music and recognized a voice that wasn't sugarcoating life's hardships. But success is rarely a straight upward line. As the late 1950s rolled around, she continued recording with Capitol, often traveling from Nashville to California on her own dime. The label's West Coast operations were well established, but her finances took hits from all the travel costs. The bigger challenge, though, came with the cultural shift toward rock and roll. Legends like Elvis Presley were capturing the hearts of young audiences, overshadowing the more traditional country stylings that Jean championed. Meanwhile, the Nashville sound, a polished, string-laden approach that producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley were developing, began dominating country radio. Jean's brand of raw honky-tonk started feeling like the odd one out. She wasn't about to give in easily. Producer Ken Nelson decided to meet her halfway, literally, and bring her to Nashville for recording sessions to cut costs and maybe adapt her sound. Around 1958, she managed a modest chart entry with I Want to Go Where No One Knows Me, but it merely grazed the top 20. The hits became sporadic, but her talent was undiminished. Capitol tried balancing her honky-tonk roots with the slicker Nashville sound in albums like Lonesome Love, 1958, Got You on My Mind, 1961, and Heartaches and Tears, 1962. Though radio programmers weren't always sure where she fit in the new sonic landscape, she retained a loyal fan base that treasured her no-frills brand of country. Tragedy struck on March 5th, 1963, shattering whatever sense of stability she might have had. Her husband, The country singer Hawkshaw Hawkins died in the plane crash that also claimed the lives of Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, and Randy Hughes. Jean was 8 months pregnant with her second child at the time. In the blink of an eye, her world turned upside down. Her heartbreak was compounded by the logistical nightmare of supporting children in the aftermath. She seriously considered quitting the business entirely. Who wouldn't after such a traumatic blow? But Opry president Jack DeWitt gently nudged her to keep going, reminding her that music was not only her livelihood, but also her calling. So later in 1963, she mustered her courage and walked back onto the stage at the Grand Ole Opry, defying her grief. The audience reaction was thunderous. This was no mere comeback. It was a testament to the unbreakable spirit that had guided her from the start. The following year, 1964, she returned to the studio. Among the songs she recorded was Second Fiddle to an Old Guitar. This track climbed to number 5 on the charts, an unexpected triumph that felt like fate handing her a second wind. It even snagged a Grammy nomination, emphasizing that Jean wasn't just a relic from the 1950s. She was still firmly in the game. She capitalized on that moment, releasing the album Lighthearted and Blue, which peaked at number 17 on the country albums chart. During the mid to late 1960s, she reeled off a string of top 40 hits. There was Many Happy Hangovers to You, which waltzed up to number 13, and If Teardrops Were Silver, a track that showcased her knack for turning sorrow into something emotionally resonant, yet musically compelling. She even paired up with Ray Pillow for I'll Take the Dog in 1966, a fun, lively single that made the top 10. Her subsequent albums, Many Happy Hangovers, 1966, and Heart, We Did All That We Could, 1967, also performed well, occasionally cracking into the top 10 of the country albums chart. Amid these professional peaks came tumult in her personal life. After Hawkshaw's death, she eventually married a police detective named Archie Summers. But the union was short-lived, largely due to his struggle with alcoholism. They divorced by 1968, the same year she tied the knot with musician Benny Birchfield. It was a relationship that would bring stability, companionship, and creative camaraderie, everything she'd been lacking since losing Hawkshaw. In the late 1960s, she bounced between producers, ultimately settling on Larry Butler, who found clever ways to showcase Jean's distinct country style, even as mainstream tastes veered popward. Tracks like 7 Lonely Days, 1969, and Then He Touched Me, 1970, fared decently, with the latter hitting number 1, 8, and scoring another Grammy nod. However, by 1971, Capitol Records seemed less interested in pushing Jean's material. The industry was chasing new fads, new stars, and leaving behind some of its honky-tonk heroes. She decided to part ways with Capitol in 1972. Many artists of that era would have just faded off, but not Jean Shepard. In February 1973, she signed with United Artists. Her first single under that banner was Slippin' Away, a vibrant tune that soared to number 1, 4 on the country chart, and even made a brief appearance on the Pop Hot 100. This was her biggest hit in almost a decade, a jolt of fresh electricity through her career. The companion album, Slippin' Away, landed at number 15 on the country albums list. She was back in the spotlight, working again with Larry Butler's production expertise. During 1974 and 1975, she scored more solid chart outings. I'll Do Anything It Takes to Stay With You and The Tip of My Fingers both landed in the top 20. She also released Poor Sweet Baby and 10 more Bill Anderson songs, 1975, paying tribute to one of Nashville's most prolific songwriters. But her return to prominence wasn't just about personal success. Jean Shepard believed in preserving country's core identity, something she felt was under threat from the increasing pop crossover wave. This belief led her to co-found the Association of Country Entertainers, AC, around 1974 to 1975. The immediate spark for ACE's creation was Olivia Newton-John's Female Vocalist of the Year win at the CMA Awards. Olivia was a supremely talented singer, but she was primarily a pop artist dabbling in country. For Jean and others of her mindset, this was a sign that the industry might be drifting too far from its roots. Shepard spoke out, passionately defending the gritty, authentic style she'd come up in. Unfortunately, ACE faced financial problems. Jean ended up pouring a lot of her own money into it, eventually going bankrupt in an attempt to sustain the organization. But the stand she took, her outspokenness about preserving real country, solidified her as one of the genre's staunchest guardians. All the while, the late 1970s found Jean battling another decline in radio support. Pop-tinged acts were dominating the airwaves. She continued releasing singles with United Artists, I'm a Believer in a Whole Lot of Lovin' among them, but they barely cracked the top 50. She moved on to the Scorpion label, where she delivered her final charting single, The Real Thing, in 1978. It hinted that the market was turning a deaf ear to older styles of honky-tonk. Yet she pressed on, focusing more on live shows, especially in places like the UK and Ireland, where traditional country enjoyed a loyal following. Throughout the 1980s, she traveled extensively across Europe, headlining festivals and smaller halls. Audiences adored her authenticity. She was the kind of performer who could make you feel every ounce of heartbreak in her ballads and all the rowdy joy in her up-tempo numbers. At home, she used her visibility to raise funds for Vietnam veterans, a cause dear to her. There was a sense that while her mainstream hits might be tapering off, her role as an ambassador for classic country was only expanding. And the Grand Ole Opry, her musical home since 1955, never wavered in its support. She was by that point something of a fixture there, inspiring the next generation of performers to hold fast to tradition. In 1985, she teamed up with Roy Drusky for an album called Together at Last. Though it didn't set the charts ablaze, it revealed a calmer, more reflective Jean Shepard, comfortable in duets and more relaxed arrangements. The 1990s brought a resurgence of interest in her early work. Labels began reissuing her Capitol material under compilations like Honky-Tonk Heroin, Classic Capitol Recordings. Her voice also popped up in various country music TV specials, particularly the popular Country's Family Reunion series, where she shared stories alongside other veterans of the scene. True to her restless spirit, she recorded new albums in the 2000s, such as the Tennessee Waltz 2000 and a gospel-tinged project titled Precious Memories 2003. She even became a spokeswoman for Springer Mountain Farms Chicken, showing that she still had a sense of humor about her celebrity status. She was no distant legend in an ivory tower. Alongside fellow trailblazers like Jan Howard, Jean Pruitt, and Jeannie Seeley, she was recognized as one of the grand ladies of the Grand Ole Opry, a moniker that fit her perfectly, regal, accomplished, yet still one of the most down-to-earth personalities you could hope to meet backstage. On November 21st, 2015, her 82nd birthday, Jean Shepard stood on the Opry stage and celebrated 60 consecutive years as a member. No other woman in Opry history had done that. She used that night not just as a milestone, but also to announce her retirement. She'd given her life and soul to country music, and she had no regrets. You might picture her on that final performance, that sturdy stance, the playful twinkle in her eye, the worn but still resonant voice telling stories of heartbreak and triumph. She had outlasted so many fleeting trends. She was a living timeline of country's evolution, from Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell through the rockabilly explosion, the countrypolitan era, the outlaw wave, and everything that came after. Jean's health began to falter in the 2010s. First, she experienced a brain deficiency that confined her to a wheelchair, though treatments helped her regain some mobility. As she pushed into her 80s, Parkinson's disease tightened its grip on her body, making it harder for her to sing, perform, or even move around independently. Yet she kept her spirits as high as she could, leaning on Benny and her extended family. By September 2016, her health had deteriorated to a point where hospice care became the only option. She died on September 25, 2016 in Gallatin, Tennessee, from complications related to Parkinson's and heart disease, just shy of her 83rd birthday. In that moment, country music lost one of its fiercest, most enduring matriarchs. The funeral on September 29th was a public affair, allowing fans and peers alike to pay their respects. In a heartbreaking twist, not long after her passing, her granddaughter was killed in a domestic violence incident. Benny Birchfield himself was wounded in the altercation while acting in self-defense, though he faced no charges. It was a final somber chapter in a life story that had already seen too much tragedy. But Jean Shepard's legacy isn't defined by those dark moments. Instead, it shines through in her music, her outspokenness about preserving country's essence, and the paths she blazed for women in a genre that too often boxed them in. Whenever you hear the opening chords of A Dear John Letter, or revisit that rebellious concept album Songs of a Love Affair, or see footage of her passionately speaking out for the Association of Country Entertainers, you're reminded of a performer who refused to be anything less than authentic. She might have had setbacks, labels losing faith, radio turning its back, personal heartbreak, but she never strayed from the core of who she was, a honky-tonk singer who believed in telling stories of real life, no matter how messy or heartbreaking. So the next time you crave that raw, classic flavor of country, cue up Jean Shepard's tracks. Let the steel guitar weep. Let that vibrant honky-tonk beat carry you away to another time. And as you hear her sing about heartbreak, wandering, sin, redemption, real human experiences, remember the woman behind the microphone. She was more than just a pioneer, more than just a chart-topping star or a Grand Ole Opry legend. She was a fighter who never stopped pushing for the music she loved, who survived loss that would crush most people, and who stood on stage in her 80s to say, I still believe in this. That's Jean Shepard, and no matter how the country music landscape changes, her place within it remains carved in stone.